provides a lot of useful, practical stratagems for making sure governance is better. This is an area which also affects something that a lot is talked about, the 17th Amendment, which is actually a nonsensical amendment, because it completely confuses two elements of constitutionality. One is an executive presidential system, and nowhere in the world is the executive president told to appoint people other people have recommended. It's nonsense. Where a president rubber stamps what other people have appointed, but it's a non-executive president, like the Queen or the Indian president. The real ruler of the country, who is the Prime Minister, nominates someone and the Queen appoints. But even then there's a safeguard, because the Prime Minister is going to nominate a complete idiot, because the Queen might say, come on, Mr. Blair or Mr. Brown, don't be silly. But on an executive presidential system, the president appoints, but of course it's agreed that the president also shouldn't appoint anyone he likes. So how do you control that? Not by telling the president whom to appoint, but by having a system of ratification.
That is the alternative.
The Senate looks at the nominees the president puts forward and says, Mr. President, they have a hearing and say, I don't think this person is suitable, or whatever. So that is really the mechanism in order to give the executive presidents elected by the people the right to appoint his people to positions of authority, but to make sure that they are not arbitrary appointments. Now, the obvious mechanism to do this is also a body that's representative of the people, which a Senate would be. The present Constitutional Council is actually an absurd body. It's appointed in a rather mad way. And it has flaws because, for instance, people blame this government. It was President Kumaratunga who just absolutely refused to appoint the Elections Commission the Constitutional Council nominated. She just said, don't be silly, I'm not appointing it, and she didn't. And nothing could happen. Then the Speaker couldn't send 10 names because people were disagreeing. So, when you have such a flawed mechanism which doesn't work often, then what you must do is correct it. You can't say it's a mad mechanism and let's work with it. Unfortunately, when you had this opposition that was still hankering after regime change, regime change to the extent of putting forward Sarath Fonseca to promote regime change. If you're such a mad opposition, you're not going to get a proper amendment. So these are areas I think the government will have to work very hard, quickly. There's no point waiting.
When the opposition slogan also was that the abolition of the executive presidency. So with the two-thirds, getting the two-thirds, what is the government plan with respect to that?
Well, if you look at the President's manifesto, he talks about adapting the executive presidency. I think, don't forget that it's not a question of a presidency or prime ministership, because after all, a prime minister with excessive power would be equally obnoxious to people who think they abuse it. My view, of course, is when you have a capable, competent president, as we have now, and as I think we had up to a point, although he started badly in President Premadasa's time, the country does develop. When you have a wicked person like Jayawardena who had wonderful opportunities, the country degenerates. President Kumaratunga was certainly not a bad person like President Jayawardena, but she just wasn't competent. We just didn't develop. And if you look at the massive development that's happened in the last 4 years together with prosecuting a war against terror successfully, I think it shows you that a good executive president is a tremendous asset. But he himself has agreed that he doesn't want unlimited powers.
So we have very little time, Professor, now, but we also know that there can be a fear when it comes to two-thirds of the power, that because absolute power corrupts absolutely. So there can be a genuine fear when it comes to stakeholders and the society of giving the two-thirds to the government. What can you say to that?
Well, I think the people of this country will decide, and I don't see any reason to worry about it in the hands of a government that has, its stewardship has fulfilled all the promises. There are 4 areas, I think, in which this government has proved itself. One is it got rid of terror, and if you think that that was something, we forget how terrible the situation was in this country for so long. Secondly, it has ensured pluralism. People who ignore the real strong Tamils who stood out against terror should recognize that all of them are with the government. Mr. Devananda, who was really brave, Mr. Siddharthan, Mr. Karuna, Mr. Pillayan, Mr. Tondaman, right? Then, if you also include the people in the TNA, there were people who said some people in the TNA were under pressure. But we also know the people who used to trumpet the LTT lines in public, saying that the LTT are the sole representatives of the Tamil people. But you have people there. Then you had development. I mean, the development in the East has been fantastic. That's something we should talk about later. I went to Ampare after 2 years. The roads, the towns, and my former students who were there just told me, the economy is booming. The people are now happy because they're not under threat anymore.
You're speaking about Ampare now.
Ampare, which I had been to after 2 years. I found Trinco and Betty the same. In 2008 when I went, I had to travel in Ahmed car. 2009 the roads were moving. The kids are learning. I was delighted to find, in the Muslim areas, the women so vibrant and going to university. And then Jaffna, the commerce in Jaffna. Again, when I went in 2009, I went in Ahmed Kar. All the General Chandrasekhar had the foresight to have a Future Minds exhibition then. 12 months later, things were open. And when I was up there in January, I mean, the shops, the goldsmith shops, they were all open at 7, 8 in the evening. So this is development, and it's gone together with infrastructural development. Unfortunately, this government hasn't been very good at advertising all the great work it's done, but people who've driven there have just seen the changes.
What can you say very shortly about the reconciliation efforts, Professor, because you were the former Secretary General of the Peace Secretariat, very, very in brief?
Well, I think that's a whole new question, but I think we could be doing more. I think we need to do more to bring people together. We need to be doing more for educational exchanges. I think it's been very important, and this is something that began with the last government. This government has, Mr. Kumatunga's government, of making sure that children learnt, Sinhala and Tamil children learnt the other language, English medium education, which I hope, or bilingual, which I hope will allow people of different communities to work together. I think we need to fast forward training at higher levels, vocational training has to be much more cohesive, where we can also do things like soft skills and socialization. But it's all very easy, really, if we have the will. And I think we now have the way, because the country is united, and the country has people who are now willing to work together. The public servants in the north have shown themselves admirable in trying to fast forward the plans of the Presidential Task Force. In the east, they've worked well. Of course, we need to make sure that employment goes to the people of the area. Those are things we need to be strong on, and make absolutely sure that the economic prosperity comes together with social cohesion.
So maybe that is a topic we have to start another discussion, especially reconciliation, because I think that is one of the crucial things that has to happen for the country to come together. So Professor, I think we touched on a variety of issues, starting from the fundamental rights case with respect to the former general and former general being court-martialed today, and also in the light of the statements made by the former Chief Justice and and your comments on the same, and also the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon's possible probe with respect to war crimes, and also the Human Rights Council Commissioner Navanitha Pillai. And also we spoke about the different school of thoughts that might be prevailing inside the country. And also we also touched very briefly on reconciliation, and more in depth with respect to constitutional reforms and the need of the 2/3, and why the government has asked for a 2/3, and whether it will account to absolute power corrupts absolutely. But then he also went on to talk about how government has been successful in especially these 4 areas about ending the war on terror, and also development, and also reconciliation, and so on and so forth. So thank you, Professor, for all this information that you have brought to the round table today, and good night.
Good night, and thank you.
And thank you very much for watching us tonight. Have a good night. Do watch us tomorrow at the same time.